Popular culture paints the Middle Ages as an era of great battles, intrigue, and monumental castles. Our idea of survival in those days often boils down to the image of a knight in armor or a peasant hiding from raiders. But this is only the dramatic tip of the iceberg. The real daily struggle for life was much quieter, more prosaic, and more technological than we are accustomed to thinking. It was not a battle with swords in hand, but a constant struggle against dampness, darkness, hunger, and entropy. The slow destruction of everything that had been created by man. Survival did not depend on heroic deeds, but on a set of inconspicuous but vital skills. How to preserve food without a refrigerator. How do you light your home when candles are a luxury? How do you make an ordinary barrel airtight to preserve crops or water? These questions were much more relevant to medieval people than dynastic disputes between kings. The answers to these questions are the real secrets of survival, hidden in everyday details and long-forgotten practices. Watch the video to the end to find out what inconspicuous technologies and household tricks actually allowed people to survive another day. In the modern world, we take light for granted. One flick of a switch and the darkness recedes. In the Middle Ages, however, light was a precious and strictly limited resource. For most people, night was a time of almost complete darkness, broken only by moonlight or the glow of a hearth. Wax candles were incredibly expensive. They were made from beeswax, which was a scarce material, and most of it was used for the needs of the church. Such a candle, burning with an even, clean flame and a pleasant honey aroma, was a symbol of status, available only to the highest nobility and clergy. More common were tallow candles made from animal fat, but even these were expensive. They burned unevenly, smoked heavily, and gave off an unpleasant odor. For a peasant or a simple townsperson, spending money on a tallow candle was often an unaffordable luxury. Therefore, the basis of the lighting economy of the common people was a different, practically free technology that required only time and knowledge. The solution to this problem was a simple but effective technology, the rushlight. This was the main source of light for peasants and townspeople for centuries. The technology for making it was accessible to everyone and remained unchanged for centuries. In the fall after the harvest, entire families would go to the marshes and riverbanks to gather ripe stalks of common sedge, or rushes. They were carefully cleaned of their tough outer skin, leaving only a thin continuous strip that acted as a reinforcing frame and prevented the fragile core from falling apart. The inner porous core of the stem, similar to foam, was an ideal natural wick. These blanks were then carefully dried for several weeks, often hanging in bunches under the roof. The next step was to prepare the combustible material. Most often this was animal fat left over from cooking, such as beef or mutton. Any fat waste was carefully collected and stored in a special pot. Before making the candles, the fat was melted over a low heat. The dried reeds were dipped into hot but not boiling fat one or more times, allowing each layer to harden. The fat soaked into the porous core, turning the thin stem into a primitive candle. The finished rush lights were fragile and were stored in special dry boxes. Such a candle burned dimly with a characteristic smoky haze and the smell of burnt fat, but provided enough light for small household tasks such as mending clothes, sharpening tools, or spinning. The length of a standard rush light was about 30 centimeters, and it burned for about 15-20 minutes. There were special metal holders for it called nips, similar to tongs on a weighted base, which clamped the candle at an angle. The angle was important. Too horizontal and it would burn too quickly. Too vertical and the flame could go out. This simple technology, based on readily available materials, was the only way to extend daylight hours for millions of people. Do you think modern people, accustomed to bright and free light, could adapt to a world where every hour of lighting requires labor and resources? Write your opinion in the comments. We are used to thinking of a barrel as a simple wooden container. In the Middle Ages, however, a well-made barrel was a model of high technology, no less complex and important than a good sword or plow. The economy, logistics, and ultimately survival depended directly on the quality of barrels. In a world without plastic, industrial glass, and stainless steel, barrels were the universal module for storing and transporting almost everything. The profession of cooper was extremely respected. Master coopers formed powerful guilds that strictly guarded the secrets of their craft, and it took many years to train an apprentice. Barrels were used to store water, wine, ale, honey, salted fish, meat, grain, flour, gunpowder, nails, and even documents. Their secret lay in their ability to be completely airtight, retaining liquids and protecting the contents from moisture. The art of barrel making, cooperage, was both a carpentry and an engineering skill. The process began with selecting the right wood. Oak was most commonly used due to its strength, density, and high tannin content, which acted as a natural preservative. The wood for barrels was not sawn, but split along the grain. This process, known as riving, preserved the natural capillary structure of the wood, medullary rays, intact, making the staves, the planks that make up the barrel, much stronger and less permeable to water. The staves were dried in the open air for several years, after which they were carefully trimmed to give them a complex convex-concave shape. Then the assembly began. The staves were held together with temporary hoops, and a brazier with coals was placed inside. Under the influence of heat and steam, the wood became pliable. This firing process not only softened the wood, but also caramelized the sugars on its inner surface, giving the wine or whiskey its characteristic notes of vanilla and spices. Then, using a winch or a system of levers, the craftsmen slowly pulled the staves together, giving the barrel its characteristic pot-bellied shape. This shape was not for beauty. It provided incredible structural strength, allowing the barrels to withstand falls and high internal pressure. After that, permanent hoops were fitted to the barrel, most often made of iron strips or strong young wood. The bottom and lid were inserted into specially cut grooves called uteri. Not a drop of glue was used. The tightness was achieved solely by the precise fitting of the parts. A good cooper could make a barrel so tight that it could store wine for decades without leaking a drop. This technology made it possible to trade liquid goods over vast distances and create food reserves that could save a city during a siege or a village during a famine. But how were foods that could not simply be poured into liquid stored? Preserving perishable foods, especially meat and fish, during the warm months was one of the most difficult tasks of the Middle Ages. Without refrigerators, any fresh provisions would spoil in a matter of days. Salting, smoking, and drying were the main methods, but they altered the taste of the food and were not suitable for everything. The problem was particularly acute in late spring and early summer, the hungry season, when winter supplies of pickles were running low and the new harvest was not yet ripe. The ability to preserve fresh food during this period was not just a luxury, but a strategic advantage. In the richest castles and monasteries, there was an amazing technology that allowed them to use cold even in the middle of summer: the ice house. This was not just a basement room, but a complex engineering structure that worked on the principles of thermal insulation. Choosing a location for the ice house was the first and most important step. It was always built in the shadiest part of the estate, often dug into the northern slope of a hill so that the earth itself would serve as a natural insulator. The ice house was a deep, often round or conical pit dug into the ground and carefully lined with stone or brick. It could be several meters deep. Insulation was key. The walls were often double, and the space between them was filled with a material with low thermal conductivity, such as charcoal, sawdust, or ballast made of broken stone. The roof of the ice house was usually conical, covered with a thick layer of straw or turf, which also served as excellent heat insulators. The entrance to the ice house was a long descending corridor, often with several doors that created a system of airlocks, minimizing the inflow of warm air each time it was open. The process of harvesting ice was a large-scale annual event. In the depths of winter, when ponds, lakes, or specially flooded meadows were covered with thick ice, teams of workers would go out onto the ice. Using long, two-handed saws similar to those used for felling trees, they cut out large, smooth blocks of ice. These blocks, weighing hundreds of kilograms, were pulled out of the water with large iron tongs and winches, loaded onto sleds or carts drawn by oxen, and slowly transported to the ice house. Inside the glacier, the painstaking work of stacking began. The blocks of ice were stacked as tightly as possible, and each layer was covered with a thick layer of straw or sawdust. Thanks to its tubular structure, the straw created thousands of air pockets, which were the best insulators known at the time. The goal was to create one giant, monolithic block of ice, protected on all sides. The bottom of the ice house had to have a drainage system, a stone-lined channel that drained meltwater into a special well or away from the structure, as standing water significantly accelerates the melting of the remaining ice. A well-built and properly filled glacier could preserve ice until the following winter. The products in it were not frozen in the modern sense, but rather cooled. Perishable foods such as butter, cream, game, or fish were placed in airtight clay or tin containers and placed on shelves along the walls or directly in niches carved into the ice mass. The ice itself, harvested from ponds, was not considered clean enough for consumption. It was used exclusively as a coolant. This was an incredible luxury available only to the wealthiest. The ability to serve chilled wine or a cream-based dessert in July was not just a culinary delicacy, but a powerful demonstration of status and power, showing that the owner of the castle could afford to control even the seasons. When we talk about medieval clothing, the first thing that comes to mind is coarse wool. Wool was indeed the main material, especially for outerwear, thanks to its warmth and durability. However, beneath the woolen cloaks and tunics lay another equally important material: linen. Linen fabric was an integral part of medieval life, from peasants to kings, and served an essential hygienic and protective function, acting as a kind of personal climate control system. Flax was produced from the stems of the plant of the same name, Linum usitatissimum. Its cultivation was a complex agro-technical process. Flax quickly depleted the soil, requiring careful crop rotation. It was harvested without mowing, but by pulling it out by the roots so as not to lose a single centimeter of valuable fiber. This was followed by a multi-stage and labor-intensive processing process. First, the flax was soaked in water, in rivers, ponds, or special pits. This process, called retting, allowed bacteria to break down the pectin substances that bound the fibers to the woody part of the stem. The process was accompanied by a strong, unpleasant odor. The flax was then dried and crushed with special wooden brakes, similar to large garlic presses, to break up the fragile woody core. After that, it was scutching, beating the bundles of stems with a flat wooden blade to separate the tough bast. Finally, the most delicate stage began: heckling. The fibers were pulled through several rows of iron combs, from the coarsest and thickest to the finest and thinnest. This allowed the long, silky, and most valuable fibers, line, to be separated from the short and coarse ones, tow. The long fibers were spun into a thin, strong thread for expensive cloth. The short fibers were used to make sackcloth, ropes, or coarse fabric. Spinning on hand spindles, drop spindles, and later on primitive spinning wheels was almost exclusively a women's occupation, occupying all their free time. Then weavers on vertical or horizontal looms created the fabric. Unlike wool, linen was smooth, cool to the touch, and most importantly, very hygroscopic. It absorbed moisture perfectly. All underwear was made from linen: shirts, undershirts, and breeches. This linen layer between the body and the coarse, often prickly woolen clothing was the first level of comfort. But its main function was hygienic. Linen underwear absorbed sweat and skin secretions, protecting expensive outer clothing from dirt. Heavy woolen items were difficult to wash, so they were more often cleaned and aired. Linen shirts, on the other hand, could be boiled with ash, which served as lye, and bleached in the sun. Regularly changing underwear was the main way to maintain personal hygiene. Therefore, even a poor person had several changes of linen shirts. This incredible value and labor-intensive production gave rise to a whole culture of respect for fabric that is completely alien to our modern world. Clothes were not disposable. They were capital, and what did people do when this capital began to wear out? In the modern world, we are used to fast fashion and cheap clothes. An item that is torn or out of fashion is easily replaced with a new one. In the Middle Ages, however, fabric was one of the most valuable commodities. Its production, whether wool or linen, required enormous amounts of time and labor. A roll of good cloth or linen could cost more than a cow and represented a significant amount of capital. Clothing was an important part of inheritance and was listed in wills alongside land, livestock, and tools. Moreover, there were strict laws against luxury, sumptuary laws that regulated what fabrics and colors could be worn by representatives of different social classes. The right to wear silk, velvet, or certain shades of scarlet and purple was a privilege of the highest nobility. Thus, fabric was not just a material, but a marker of social status and personal wealth that had to be preserved at all costs. Therefore, any piece of clothing had a very long life, going through many stages of alteration and repair. Throwing away clothes was unthinkable. The first stage was repair. Any hole or tear was immediately sewn up. Needles made of bone, bronze, or steel were valuable tools that were kept in special needle cases. The art of darning was highly developed, allowing not only to close a hole, but also to weave new threads into the fabric structure, strengthening the weakened area. If the fabric was worn through on the elbows or knees, a patch was placed on the spot, often from a piece of another old garment. Over time, an item could be covered with many patches of different colors and textures. When clothes became too tight or went out of fashion, they were not thrown away, but carefully unstitched along the seams. The resulting pieces of fabric were washed and sometimes dyed a new color using vegetable dyes, for example, onion peel broth for yellow-brown shades or woad for blue, to refresh their appearance. Only then would the tailor rework the fabric, using the least worn parts to create new clothes for the younger generation. Large pieces were used for new items, and small scraps were carefully saved for future patches. When clothes became so worn that they could no longer be worn, their life cycle did not end. They were cut into smaller pieces. The good parts could be used to make bags, sacks, or quilted linings for clothing. From the many layers of quilted linen and fabric scraps, gambesons were made, soft armor worn under chainmail. This was a vital use of textile waste in military affairs. The most worn-out pieces of fabric were turned into rags for cleaning, filters for straining liquids, or even wicks for oil lamps. It was a zero-waste economy, dictated not by concern for the environment, but by harsh necessity. And even that was not the end of it. The most worn-out linen and cotton rags were the most valuable raw material for one of the most important medieval industries, paper manufacturing. Before the spread of paper made from wood pulp, which happened much later, paper was made from recycled textiles. Rags were collected by special rag pickers, sorted, and then left to rot at a paper mill, where they were ground in vats until they became a fibrous mass. This pulp was then continuously beaten with heavy hammers, driven by a water wheel until the fibers were completely separated. The mass was then scooped up with special mesh frames, drained, pressed, and dried to produce sheets of paper. In this way, an old linen shirt, having served its purpose as clothing and rags, could find a new life as a page in a manuscript or an important document. We see medieval castles and cathedrals as eternal stone monoliths, but stone itself is just a collection of blocks. What turns them into a single, strong, and durable structure is mortar. And in the Middle Ages, this technology was far from modern cement. The main binding material was lime mortar, the production and use of which was a real science based on centuries of experience. The basis of the mortar was lime, which was obtained by burning limestone or chalk in special kilns, lime kilns. These kilns, often built on a hillside for ease of loading, were large structures that required a huge amount of firewood and several days of continuous work. At a high temperature of around 900 degrees Celsius, calcium carbonate decomposed, releasing carbon dioxide, and turned into quicklime, or calcium oxide. This was an unstable and corrosive substance. To obtain a solution, it was slaked, mixed with water. This process was extremely dangerous. The reaction was violent, releasing large amounts of heat and steam that could cause severe burns. Slaked lime was often produced in special pits, where the resulting lime paste, or pushonka, could mature for months and for particularly important work, such as fresco painting, even for years. The longer the lime matured, the more plastic and of higher quality it became. The resulting slaked lime was mixed with a filler, most often sand and water. Sometimes animal wool or hair was added to the solution for strength as a reinforcing fiber, especially for plastering work. But the main secret of lime mortar was not its strength, but its vapor permeability. Unlike modern cement mortar, which creates a rigid waterproof barrier, lime mortar worked like a sponge. It was porous and allowed the wall to breathe. In rainy weather, it absorbed moisture from the air and stone, and in dry weather, it slowly released it back. This mechanism was vital for the longevity of stone buildings in England's damp climate. If moisture had been trapped inside the wall by an impermeable mortar, it would have expanded when frozen, tearing the stone and masonry from the inside. The breathing lime mortar prevented this by acting as a passive humidity regulator. Moreover, the process of hardening was very slow. It did not simply dry out, but carbonized, a slow absorption of carbon dioxide from the air, during which it was converted back into calcium carbonate, essentially an artificial stone. This process could take decades, and the older the masonry became, the stronger it was, turning the wall into a single breathing monolith. But how did the builders of these massive structures navigate without modern navigation devices? In a world without GPS and accurate clocks, orientation in space and time was based on observing nature and simple but effective instruments. Survival, trade, and even construction depended on the ability to read the language of the sun, stars, and water. The main point of reference, of course, was the sun. Travelers and builders could determine the cardinal directions using a gnomon, a simple vertical pole. At noon, the shadow cast by the gnomon was shortest and pointed directly north, in the northern hemisphere. A line drawn perpendicular to this shadow gave the west-east direction. This method allowed buildings to be oriented with sufficient accuracy. For example, the practice of building churches at Orientum, with the altar facing east, was not symbolic but astronomical. The master mason had to determine the direction of the sunrise on the saint's day to whom the temple was dedicated in order to lay the foundation in the correct direction. This was applied astronomy in action. At night, the starry sky was the main assistant. The North Star, which hardly ever moves, was a reliable indicator of north. Travelers and sailors found it by the Big Dipper of the Big Dipper or by the constellation Cassiopeia. Knowledge of the constellations and their movements across the sky was not just a curious fact, but a vital navigational skill. To determine the time more accurately at night, scientists and navigators used an instrument called a nocturnal. It was a simple analog calculator, usually made of wood or brass, consisting of several discs. The observer would align the central hole with the North Star and then align a movable lever with certain pointer stars, for example, from the Big Dipper. The scale on the device showed the time of night with remarkable accuracy for that era. This made it possible, for example, to keep a night watch on a ship according to a precise schedule. Measuring time was more complicated. The 24 hours we are used to were the domain of astronomers. In everyday life, the day was divided into 12 day and 12 night hours, the duration of which varied depending on the season. A summer day could last 80 modern minutes, while a winter day could last only 40. This system, known as the temporal hour, was intuitive for an agrarian society whose rhythm of life was completely dependent on sunlight. The main tool for measuring time during the day was the sundial. These could be large stationary clocks on the walls of churches and castles, or small portable diptychs made of ivory. However, they were useless in cloudy weather and at night. For continuous time measurement, mainly in monasteries where it was important to observe the exact order of worship, more complex devices were used. One of them was a water clock, or clepsydra. It was a vessel with a small hole from which water flowed out evenly. The water level in the vessel showed how much time had passed. Engineers of the time struggled with the problem of changing water pressure as the vessel emptied, devising complex container shapes, such as conical ones, to equalize the flow. More advanced models could have a float with a pointer or even activate a mechanism that struck the hours. Another method was to use graduated candles. Monasteries produced candles of a strictly defined size and density on which marks corresponding to the hours were applied. As the candles burned down, it was possible to keep track of time fairly accurately during the night. But for most people, the main timekeeper was the ringing of the nearest church bells, which marked the canonical hours of prayer and set the general rhythm of the working day. In the era before standardized fasteners, welding, and bolted connections, one of the most important technological skills was the ability to tie the right knots. Rope was a universal material, and a knot was a universal tool for connecting, securing, lifting, and holding almost anything. The strength of a structure, the safety of cargo, and the safety of people depended on the correct choice and execution of a knot. It was a whole applied science, the knowledge of which was passed down from master to apprentice, and was as important an element of the craft as the ability to work with a plane or a hammer. The knot was a kind of software, that activated the hardware, the rope itself. Without the right knot, even the strongest rope was useless. The rope itself was the result of a complex manufacturing process. The best ropes were made from hemp fibers, which was valued for its strength and resistance to rot. Flax, nettles, and even twisted strips of leather were also used. The manufacturing process took place in rope walks, long, straight sheds, or simply on open paths, which could be several hundred meters long. The fibers were first spun into yarn, then several strands of yarn were twisted into strands, and 3 or 4 strands were in turn twisted into a rope. At each stage, the direction of twisting was reversed, creating internal tension that prevented the rope from unraveling under load. For marine use, ropes were additionally impregnated with hot pine resin, which made them water-resistant and significantly extended their service life in aggressive salt environments. Knowledge of knots was highly specialized. Sailors, builders, and farmers had their own completely different vocabularies of knots, adapted to their specific needs. Sailors' knots had to hold securely under variable loads and untie quickly, even after getting wet. Builders' knots used to tie scaffolding had to be as strong as possible and not weaken over time. In addition, knots were an integral part of the creation of the simplest mechanisms. A rope passed through a system of blocks, created a pulley, a system for lifting heavy loads that multiplied human strength many times over. It was thanks to this technology, which depended entirely on the correct knots, that the builders of Gothic cathedrals were able to lift huge stone blocks to dizzying heights. Each knot had its own specific purpose, based on an intuitive understanding of physics. A straight knot was used to tie 2 ropes of the same thickness. For ropes of different thicknesses, a bowline knot was used. To create a non-tightening loop at the end of a rope that could be thrown over a pole or used for safety, they used the king of knots, the bowline knot. Its unique structure distributed the load so that the knot never tightened completely and could always be easily untied. This was critically important in seafaring. In construction, when erecting scaffolding on cathedral walls, wooden beams were tied together with special square and diagonal ties, using a bowline knot to secure the rope to the support. The entire structure was held together solely by the friction created by the correctly tied knots. To lift loads, such as stone blocks, slip knots were used, such as the timber hitch, which tightened securely under the weight of the load, but loosened instantly as soon as the tension was released. Sailors and fishermen had their own set of knots for working with sails and nets. A well-tied fishing net was a complex engineering product consisting of thousands of correctly executed knots. Knowledge of knots was not just a practical skill, it was a system for encoding the mechanical properties of rope. A person who mastered this art could use a simple rope to create complex lever systems, secure scaffolding, moor a ship in a storm, or securely tie valuable cargo to a cart for a long journey. Choosing the wrong knot or tying it incorrectly could have disastrous consequences. Therefore, the ability to read rope and speak the language of knots was one of the fundamental secrets of medieval survival. Not all medieval buildings were made of stone. Stone was an expensive and labor-intensive material used for building castles, churches, and the homes of wealthy townspeople. The dwellings of most ordinary people were built using a much more affordable and quicker technique known as wattle and daub. This technique, examples of which can still be seen in half-timbered houses in England and continental Europe, allowed for the creation of strong and relatively warm walls using the most common materials, wood, clay, and straw. This was not a sign of poverty, but an example of rational and sustainable construction, ideally adapted to local resources. The basis of the structure was a strong wooden frame made of thick, load-bearing beams, most often made of oak. The carpenters who built these frames were highly skilled craftsmen. They processed the logs by hand using axes and adzes, and used complex carpentry joints such as tenon and mortise, or dovetail, which were fastened with wooden pegs. This frame was a self-supporting skeleton that could stand for centuries. The space between the beams was filled with wattle. To do this, thin stakes or branches, staves, were inserted vertically into the grooves of the frame, which were then tightly woven together with flexible rods, withies, most often made of hazel or willow. The process resembled weaving a giant basket directly into the wall. The wattle had to be dense enough to hold the clay coating, but loose enough to allow the clay to penetrate and bond securely with the frame. The next step was to apply the coating. Clay was mixed with water, straw, grass, or even manure. It was a kind of medieval composite material chemistry. The clay provided mass and thermal insulation. The straw acted as a reinforcing material, like modern fiber in concrete, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried. Manure, in addition to improving the plasticity of the mixture, contained enzymes that acted as a natural preservative for the wattle. The mixture was often prepared in a special pit, where it was kneaded with feet until the desired consistency was achieved. The resulting mass was applied by hand to the wattle frame on both sides, carefully filling all the gaps. The layer could be up to 115 centimeters thick. The clay created a solid, airtight wall that kept the heat in really well. After drying, the clay walls were whitewashed with lime. This wasn't just for looks. The layer of lime protected the clay from moisture and rain and also had some antiseptic properties preventing the growth of mold. The roofs of such houses were most often covered with a thick layer of straw or reeds. Laying a thatched roof was a separate art. The master roofer laid the straw in dense, overlapping layers, starting from the eaves and moving toward the ridge. Each layer was attached to the roof frame with tarred twine or flexible rods. The finished roof, up to 30 centimeters thick, was completely waterproof and served as an excellent insulator, keeping cool in summer and warm in winter. The wattle and daub technology was quick, cheap, and effective. It allowed an entire village to build or repair houses in a short period of time, using only local, readily available materials. It was an example of folk building art that provided basic housing for millions of people. In an era when literacy was the preserve of the clergy and a narrow circle of aristocrats, and books were handwritten and fabulously expensive, the human brain was the main repository of information. The cost of a single handwritten Bible, which required the labor of several scribes and parchment made from hundreds of calf skins, could be comparable to the cost of an entire estate. Therefore, the art of memory was not just a useful skill, but a fundamental technology for survival on which society depended. The vast amounts of data that we store on digital media today were stored in the minds of medieval people. Lawyers and judges memorized entire codes of law and precedents. Merchants kept track of hundreds of commercial transactions, prices, and debt obligations. Poets, storytellers, and bards could recite epic poems consisting of tens of thousands of lines, containing the history and mythology of their people for hours on end. But most important of all was everyday practical memory. Healers and herbalists knew hundreds of plants and their properties, recipes for medicines, and methods of application. Peasants knew by heart the boundaries of all the fields in their village, oral agreements on the use of communal lands, and a complex agricultural calendar based on signs. The memory of the community elders served as a living archive, replacing written documents. There was even a ritual called beating the bounds, when the elders of the community led the young people around the boundaries of the parish, showing them key points and sometimes even symbolically striking them so that knowledge of the boundaries would be fixed in their memory through a vivid experience. When concluding oral agreements, witnesses were specially invited whose sole task was to memorize all the terms so that they could later confirm them. Special mnemonic techniques were used to facilitate memorization. Information was often encoded in the form of poems, songs, or rhyming sayings. Rhymes and rhythms serve as powerful hooks for memory, making it easy to reproduce long sequences of data. For example, the properties of herbs or the sequence of agricultural work were memorized in the form of simple songs. Genealogical trees and historical chronicles were passed down in the form of ballads and sagas, where the narrative structure helped to keep complex sequences of names and events in memory. Moreover, there were complex systems such as memory palaces or the method of loci, known since ancient times and actively used by scholars and monks. A person would mentally construct a familiar space in their imagination, such as a cathedral or a road through a village, and arrange facts or parts of speech that needed to be remembered in different places, at the altar, by the column, at the market square. To recall the information, it was enough to mentally walk through this palace and collect the necessary data. In a world without notebooks and search engines, a well-trained memory was the most reliable archive and the fastest database. It was an invisible but absolutely real technology that formed the basis of all medieval civilization. Medieval survival, as we can see, was not so much a matter of brute force as it was a matter of knowledge, precision, and foresight. It was a quiet, daily war against entropy, in which the winner was the one who better understood the properties of materials, the laws of nature, and the weaknesses of human memory. The ability to tie a knot correctly, build a watertight barrel, keep a fire going, or remember the healing properties of herbs was much more important for a long life than the ability to wield a sword. These forgotten technologies and practices form the invisible foundation on which our modern civilization was ultimately built. Which of these forgotten skills do you think could be most useful even in today's world, which is facing new challenges? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you are interested in similar in-depth analyses of historical technologies, subscribe to our channel. There are many more obscure topics to come.